Prince and Black Minneapolis, hosted by the Minnesota Historical Society in connection with the First Avenue exhibit at the History Center. The museum and exhibit may be on pause right now, but the conversations about the music and artists who have brought their gifts to the main stage continue with tonight's program and next Thursday's, which we'll link for you in the chat. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the north side of Minneapolis is located, like the Minnesota Historical Society, on the traditional homelands of the Dakota. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and center ourselves in this truth tonight. That same north side where Prince was born, where older Black artists taught him to play and write music, and where he helped create the electro-funk fusion style that is the Minneapolis sound, is the subject of Northside, a song Prince performed with the New Power generation that laid out the political stakes of Black life in Minneapolis. Professor Elliot Powell is with us tonight to explore how Prince used his funk aesthetics and songs like this to speak to the experiences of being Black in Minneapolis and to imagine a better, more just life and world for Black people in his hometown. Elliot Powell is Beverly and Richard Fink Professor in Liberal Arts and Associate Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He is an interdisciplinary scholar of U.S. popular music, race, sexuality, and politics, and is currently working on a book about the politics of sex, sexuality, and music in Minneapolis during the 1980s. Welcome, Dr. Powell.
So thank you so much, Danielle, for the introduction. Excuse me. I want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society, First Avenue, for the invitation to talk. I want to also thank everyone out there virtually for joining. I am looking forward to all of the kinds of engagement around what I'm going to be talking about in terms of today. And so, feel free to use the comment section. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, to the engagement, and all these other kinds of really sort of discussions here. So as I bring up my speech. So I want to start off by doing another kind of introduction in terms of myself and explaining why exactly I'm going to be talking about Prince in Minneapolis and Blackness. And then I'm just going to go into the formal talk itself. So as Danielle very much noted in her introduction, my name is Elliot Powell. I am a professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of American Studies. And my research really centers on Black music from multiple kinds of fields, from race and gender and sexuality and politics, these kinds of things. And over the years since I've been here at the U, and especially been here in Minneapolis, I've been here for about 6 or 7 years now, almost 7. I've helped organize the Prince from Minneapolis Symposium that was at the University of Minnesota in 2017. I also helped in writing materials for Prince's honorary doctorate process, and I also spoke at the ceremony. And importantly, I've also been teaching a class for the past 5 years that has basically used the work of Prince as a window, as a lens into grappling with the much broader culture history of Minneapolis during the 1980s. Specifically, this class is focused on how Prince's relationship to music, to race, and to sex, and to space is rooted in and routed through, and at the same time registers beyond very much the city of Minneapolis. Indeed, for example, in March of 2016, I actually took my students to the Minnesota Historical Society on a field trip. And I wanted them to see the kind of archival materials that the Minnesota Historical Society had that was really rich, that was very much kind of related to the course. They had materials that were related to First Avenue. They had Purple Rain items. And they had various kind of photography of the 1960s and 1970s Black culture in North Minneapolis and beyond. In terms of that moment in March of 2016, of course, so little did we know that Prince would pass away suddenly very much a month later. But I want to talk about this field trip to the Minnesota Historical Society because it was, without a doubt, my students' favorite activity all semester. They noted that it was there that they really felt the impact of Prince. To see him to be such an historical importance that he existed within the archive and the kind of materials that concerned him, that concerned his life, that concerned very much the space that really birthed him. Right? They noted that it was this kind of space that helped them understand, again, sort of the neighborhood that very much birthed him. And so it's with this class and with my students in mind that my remarks today are going to be in conversation. So when Danielle first approached me about speaking again at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I'll say again here because really very much sort of in addition to my students' field trip, I spoke at the Minnesota Historical Society about a year and a half ago for a really incredible event that was called Prince from Minneapolis to the World, that Prince's cousin, Charles Chaz Smith, and his wife, Victoria, helped organize. I want to give a shout out to them. And so when Danielle asked me to speak here again, she wanted to know if I could kind of expound on or expand on some of the things that I mentioned at that event, which were, in terms of my remarks, centered on Prince and Blackness in North Minneapolis. So my talk today is going to focus on those three things, but very much as I do in my class and very much as I do in my personal life, and I think that we all do this in our personal lives in terms of when we talk about Prince, I want to keep a hold of and center very much the music. I want to let the music really direct us and really directing how we feel, directing how we think. As a scholar of Black popular music, I always center how music for Black people has always been a site from where we can very much make sense of and grapple with our present and past worlds, and how music can help us imagine really different sets of worlds. And so in that spirit, my talk for today will be centered on Prince and the New Power Generation's 2001 song that's called Northside. And I'll be using that song to think more broadly about Prince, about Blackness, about Black politics, about North Minneapolis, about Minneapolis in general, and how funk, and how Prince's relationship to funk and Prince's aesthetics of funk really become the glue that connects everything, and how funk can also have a meaning for us in 2020 and very much beyond. Now, I know, right, that serious Prince fam probably know this song. But I can also imagine that some of you out there might not be that familiar with Northside, and that's perfect. That's perfectly fine, right? I always kind of tell my students whenever they take my class, I was like, if you don't know anything about Prince, that is perfectly fine. We are all here to learn. We're all here to think. We're all here to discuss. And so I want us to be on the same page here because I'm going to be talking about the song Northside. And so what I want to do is I want us to kind of have a small kind of collective kind of experience with this song. But as I think most people who know Prince and familiar with the Prince estate will know, I can't actually play the song. I mean, unless I want to have this event shut down, which of course I do not. And so what I want everyone who's watching to do is just use whatever you use to listen to music. That could be YouTube, that could be Spotify, that could be Tidal, that could be Apple Music. If you have your own music library, if you had a record player, you got a CD player, you got a Walkman. I don't know why you would have a Walkman in 2020, but 2020 is a weird year. So maybe there are folks who have Walkmans. Basically, so I want you to use whatever you have. And I want you to pull up Northside. I want you to pull up the song. I'm gonna also model this. And I want you to go to the 2 minutes and 34 second mark. And I want you to just, I'm playing it on my phone. And we're just gonna take about a minute. And we're gonna listen to really that whole, basically sort of a minute of the song. And then we're just kind of reconnect. And when you're listening to it, feel free to use the chat function to talk about what you're hearing, talk about what's happening in the song to you. If you're dancing, comment in the chat that you're dancing. You might see me bopping my head. But I'm gonna do a countdown as I put my first earbud in, and as I now put my second earbud in. We're going to do 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay. So why a song like Northside, right? Why did I have you listen to that minute? I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But why did I choose Northside as a song for my talk today, right? Why of all songs in Prince's extensive catalog, right? Am I having you kind of listen to this song, right? Well, for me, right, far too often, stories and studies about Prince fast forward through his childhood, his formative years in North Minneapolis, and they focus instead, especially on his 1980s output, his battle with Warner Brothers and his use of the unpronounceable love symbol in the 1990s, or they'll talk about his 2000s kind of professional arc. But on songs like Northside, right, Prince really hits kind of rewind on this, and he reminds us of where he's from and what he's connected to. He's connected to and he's from very much North Minneapolis and the Blackness of North Minneapolis. Indeed, Prince sings, "This is how we funk. We funk on the North Side," right? He doesn't say, "Listen, this is how you funk on the North Side." He's not saying, "This is how they funk on the North Side." There is no grammatical turn, right, where he's trying to provide any kind of distance here. Instead, Prince uses the collective of we, right? The kind of communal of we. And it's through his usage of we where Prince tells us, very much no matter the fame and no matter the money, he's still very much a proud Black man who's from North Minneapolis. And that matters. That matters because we can't get to everything that the world knows and loves about Prince without very much North Minneapolis. North Minneapolis is fundamental to the Prince experience and legacy. It's the city neighborhood that cultivated his craft. It is the area that animated his art. Very much North Minneapolis is the foundation. And as I'll speak on this further in terms of tonight, funk is the sound that supports this foundation. Indeed, funk emerges as a Black musical dance genre in the late 1960s. And so for Prince, who was born in 1958, funk was the genre of his formative years. It was the genre that surrounded him during his youth, his preteen and teenage years, and the genre that saw him through as he entered adulthood. This is why it should not surprise us that we see Prince, creating these James Brown-inspired grooves, why he's remixing this James Brown and Aretha Franklin record, why we also know this infamous playing that he had with James Brown on stage, right? None of this should actually surprise us. And it should not surprise us that later in his career, Prince is working with and signing folks like George Clinton and Larry Graham. Funk is the music that shaped him. Funk is Prince's guardian genre. And this is why on a song like Northside, Prince sings, "This is how we funk on the North Side." Funk is Prince's North Minneapolis soundtrack. So why am I talking about all this, right? You might be wondering, like, where is he actually going here? Well, I'm talking about all of this because I fundamentally believe that we cannot grapple with and account for the kinds of things that we revere and that we love about Prince without taking it back, as Prince does in Northside, to funk and taking it back to actually North Minneapolis. Indeed, when we think about and celebrate Prince, one of the things that we think about, or things that I hope that we think about, is Prince's political and unapologetic Blackness. His resistance to and critiques of racial oppression and economic forms of exploitation, his wearing of slave on his face, his commitments to the arts and education and community services for Black people, especially Black youth. Think here of his pronouncement at the Grammys that Black Lives Matter and that books and albums also still matter. We can think about the numerous stories that also came out after Prince's passing, like him donating to the Louisville, donating to the Louisville Western Branch Library, which in 1905 became the first library in the nation that was operated by and served African Americans. We can think about Prince's support of the famed African American woman educator Marva Collins, who was dedicated to equal education for Chicago's Black youth. We can't get to all of that. We can't get to any of that if we don't first talk about North Minneapolis and the North Minneapolis community leaders like Spike Moss and Bernadette Anderson. Bernadette Anderson was, of course, the mother of really then sort of Andre Anderson. Now we know him as Andre Simone, and who housed Prince really during his teenage years. Both Bernadette Anderson and Spike Moss instilled in Black youth like Prince in North Minneapolis a commitment to really community, to the arts, to education, and to politics. And in speaking of politics specifically, we also can't get to the Black political Prince without also taking into account the 1966 and 1967, Plymouth Avenue kinds of uprisings that surrounded his youth. These were a set of rebellions and uprisings in North Minneapolis. It must also be said that these kinds of rebellions were also occurring in cities across the nation at this time, 66, 67, 68, 69. These were all very much uprisings that were in response to the complete failures of the state and the nation to protect and liberate Black people, even after, and especially after, the passages of the civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. In North Minneapolis, these uprisings evidence the outright refusal of North Minneapolis Black residents to continue to be complacent with and suffer under the weight of the city's continued anti-Black racism that often came in the forms of policing and surveillance and arrest and incarceration. In essence, these were local and national uprisings that, to quote Black French West Indian philosopher and activist Frantz Fanon, quote, "We very much revolt because we can no longer breathe." And I'll read that quote again. He says that we revolt simply because we can no longer breathe. And I think it's important for us to just sit on that, right? Sit with that quote for a second. Think about the uprisings in Plymouth in 66 and 67. Think about how they resonate with the uprisings this summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and countless other Black people. Right? Think about how such uprisings resonates with the words of Frantz Fanon, right? He says sort of, we revolt simply because we can no longer breathe. Right? He wrote these words in the early 1960s. I want us to kind of sit with that, right? And how they resonate, right? And how they're connected, right? Between the uprisings in Plymouth in 66 and 67, right? Thinking about what's happening, what happened this summer, what's still happening, right? Now, funk too is also unapologetically Black and political, and very much about uprisings, and it has a kind of rebellious spirit. And as a late 1960s Black genre, funk is very much a Black dance music that, and here I'm quoting a scholar and an ethnomusicologist by the name of Portia Maltsby. And I'll quickly say that in this talk, I'm going to be quoting a number of Black scholars and thinkers of funk, and I highly recommend that you all read them, cite them, support their work, buy their work. So to go back to Portia Maltsby, she argues that funk very much, quote, reveals the resilience and the creativity of African Americans very much under changing social and economic conditions, end quote, that are brought about during the immediate post-civil rights. It's brought about during the immediate post-civil rights kind of society. And as such, to draw on another funk scholar, I'm thinking here about Tony Bolden, he says, quote, fundamental rebellion was encoded in funk music, end quote. We hear this in James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. We hear this in Sly Stone's, there's a riot going on in Fresh. We hear this in the Afrofuturist soundscapes of Parliament and LaBelle. And so to quote Portia Maltsby again, even as funk is a dance music, it still communicated, quote, a revolutionary spirit, an urban attitude of defiance that was emblematic of the call for Black solidarity, that's associated with the Black Power movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s, end quote. And so again, funk became the music that was the soundtrack of these Black rebellions in the US during very much the late 1960s and early 1970s. And again, this is the period that frames Prince's youth and his teenage years. But as it often happens, with the fury, we also get the fun. Which is to say, just as the kind of political Blackness of Prince is manifested in serious ways, it also manifests in some ways that we might not typically see or register as being serious. And here I'm thinking about dance and dancing. Prince, as hopefully we all know, loves to dance. We can think of the splits, the spins, the grinds, right? We can think about other kinds of dance moves as well. All of these have turned into an endless array of, gifts. I mean, the kind of digital gifts. I'm thinking about sort of GIF here. Prince on stage gives us the gift, and that's with the T, and the joy and happiness that dance and dancing brings. And so when I think about Prince and dance, I'm reminded of something that Spike Moss talked about at the Minnesota Historical Society last year, in terms of when he was talking about Prince in the North Minneapolis Cultural Center, that was called The Way. For context, for those who might not be familiar, The Way was established following really the Plymouth kinds of uprisings in 1966 and 1967, and became a political organizing space as well as a space for cultural events like dances. Importantly, really, The Way was also a space for Black youth to hone in various kinds of artistic crafts like music and dance and performance and other forms of artistic and creative expression. I'm reminded here of Scott Moss talking about Prince being shy sort of performing on stage in these early years at The Way, and how the rehearsals at The Way and elsewhere in North Minneapolis became spaces through which Prince became more comfortable performing on stage and dancing. That it's partly through and because of the kinds of experiences that Prince had at The Way in North Minneapolis that we get to the kind of confident, exciting, dynamic dancer that we all have grown and love, right? I'm trying to make the argument here that we actually need The Way. I didn't mean to be sort of funny in that, but we actually need The Way, we need The Way sort of in order to get to that point. So this aspect of dance is also tied to funk, of course, because funk is a Black dance music, right? We see how Prince's own moves are in conversation with those like James Brown. But more to the point, the dance impulse of funk was and is of itself very much political as well. especially at the moment of the late 1960s and early 1970s, and arguably really sort of still today, when Black people's movements were and are very much routinely confined. Here, I'm not only thinking metaphorically in the sense of the restrictions of movement between economic classes for Black people, or very much due to redlining, how Black people were confined to certain kinds of neighborhoods. But I'm also thinking literally here, and how policing and surveillance were technologies and are technologies that actively sought and still seek to limit the bodily movements of Black people. Even thinking about the long history within sort of the US and seeing Black bodies as solely sites of labor for the racial capitalist enterprise that is very much for the racist capitalist enterprise that really is the United States. So for me, it's against this kind of backdrop of the metaphoric and very much literal kinds of restrictions of Black people and Black people's movements during really the late 1960s and early 1970s that funk gave us, to quote Parliament's song, really sort of One Nation Under a Groove, funk gives us and gave us, quote, a chance to dance our way out of our own constrictions. With and through funk, Black people could move our bodies in ways that were sites of leisure rather than labor, not solely labor. Through funk, we were free to move our bodies in ways that were not allowed under racial sites and spaces of surveillance and policing and incarceration. Funk afforded Black people the freedom to move in an anti-Black world that took to violence, really depending on how a Black person moved, right? So if you're interested in learning more about this, I want to recommend the work of Francesca Royster, who's done fantastic work around funk and around dance. Right? I'm giving shout outs here, right? I am, after all, sort of an educator, right? So I'm just going to be citing folks and hoping that you kind of engage their work, because a lot of what they have said really informs my own thinking here. But it's on this subject of bodies and movements that I want to talk about another hallmark of Prince, that being the sensual, the sexual, the otherwise erotic version and aspect of Prince. This is a Prince that, we are all familiar with. Here, of course, I'm thinking about, Prince's outfits, but I'm also thinking about Prince's dance moves and dance movements. I'm thinking about his famous and sometimes infamous kind of romantic partners. When we think about his songs, there are far too many to list. I just finished a lecture actually today where I talked about the scandalous sex suites from the Batman soundtrack. So my mind here and thinking about that is obviously going to Prince and Kim Basinger dating briefly, but also the kind of rumors that some might be familiar with, others might not be. I want to give a shout out to really sort of D'Angelo Duff, who really sort of debunked this kind of rumor, right? But for those who have heard the scandalous sex suite, there are certain kinds of noises. And there was long rumors about who was making those noises, those kinds of things. So, this goes line into the kind of erotic, sensual, and sexual Prince, right? But also, right, when I think about this, I'm also thinking about two of my favorite songs. I'm thinking about Erotic City, and I'm thinking about We Can F. I'm going to go with F because I don't know. I don't know with the Minnesota Historical Society if I can curse. So let's just say We Can F. Let's just go with that. I'm going to play it safe. But such songs for me, right, and Prince's overall sexual, sensual, and erotic self are obviously very much connected to funk. Indeed, in the songs like Erotic City and We Can F, Prince replaces and plays with the slippage between F-U-N-K and, that whole other F word. But funk in a broader sense, again, I'm quoting Portia Maltsby here, again argues, has long been, quote, an expression of cultural liberation and musical experimentation and rejection of mainstream values and norms, end quote. And this has been a liberation from, an experimentation with, and a rejection of norms that govern Black sexual pleasures, Black sexual practices, Black sexual kinds of desires as well. Indeed, as scholar really Lamonda Horton Stallings has argued, funk has long been, quote, a multisensory and multidimensional philosophy, a multisensory and multidimensional philosophy, which has been used in conjunction with the erotic and eroticism and Black forms of erotica, end quote. So think here, for example, of the uses of funk in Blaxploitation films. Or more to the point, think about songs like James Brown's Mother Popcorn and Vicki Anderson's response to it. Think about James Brown again and Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine. Right? Also thinking about, I'm thinking about sort of the Prince's high school band right before they became sort of Grand Central. And I'm thinking about sort of Sex Machine being a potential name for the band, right? So I'm thinking about sort of music and artwork. We can also think about music and artwork of folks like the Ohio Players, right? About thinking about funk and notions around the erotic, around the sensual, around the sexual. I can go on for days in giving these examples, and I'm sure that you all have some as well. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that Prince's sexual, his sensual, his erotic artistry is part of a much longer, it's part of a much longer kind of lineage and genealogy and musical kinds of traditions of Black music, and specifically funk. Now, if you're wondering, all right, well, he's talked about Prince's sexual self and erotic self and sensual self and romantic self, and it makes sense in relation to funk, but how does it connect to sort of North Minneapolis, right? And I'm not going to be making the argument that North Minneapolis is a sexual or kind of erotic zone or site, right? That kind of thinking is tied to a long racist history here in terms of this nation that sees Black people as being perverse and hypersexual beings. Sometimes not even beings, right? It's usually used in conjunction with perverse hypersexual kind of savages or sort of animals, right? I'm not interested in that kind of conversation. I'm not interested in making that argument. That is not an argument that I'm actually, it's not even an argument that I'm actually going to entertain. But what I am going to say here is that I was somewhat surprised, though I guess I shouldn't have been, by how much Prince talked about love and romance and really relationships and the gendering of love and romance and really relationships in the published pages of his memoir. And how those experiences of love and love lost in North Minneapolis shaped his thinking about gender as well as the spatialization of gender. So, for those who read the memoir, right, I was really taken aback and fascinated with how Prince thought about the differences between North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, very much sort of in relation to gender. I was really shocked. In for me at least, a really sort of good way. That he was thinking about the kind of gendering of space, and thinking about space in a way that's not simply about sort of geographical kind of space, thinking about sort of cartographies. He's not interested in that. He's more interested in the kind of social and cultural aspect of space. And I think it's a really, really brilliant part of sort of his memoir here. So for me, the fact that Prince spoke at length about these teenage and childhood crushes and loves who were in North Minneapolis, for me, suggests that he was working toward establishing a foundation to speak to other kinds of romances in terms of the future of the memoir, right? That he's using these experiences of love and romance in North Minneapolis during his preteen and teenage years as a way to talk about how they took place sort of later in his life, right? So this is how, again, we see how North Minneapolis pops up again. So here for me, it's very much in the intersections of funk and North Minneapolis that they actually manifest in the personal professional life of Prince. But as we all know, we can't talk about sex and love and romance of Prince without also bringing into the conversation really sort of spirituality, right? Most explicitly, Prince's relationship to spirituality comes through in his conversion to being a Jehovah's Witness. You can think of concept albums like The Rainbow Children or Love Sexy. You can think about films like Vincent Graffiti Bridge. You can think of songs like God or I Would Die For You or Temptation, right? There are a whole host of others, obviously. But for me, we have to think of such spiritual music and moments in Prince's life as also being tied to his childhood in North Minneapolis, as he grew up being raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, but also Prince's story that he's talked about multiple times, right? About the angel who visited him and cured him of his epilepsy, right? Here again, we have how spirituality is manifesting in North Minneapolis, and it pops up again sort of later in his life. So such references to spirituality are also embedded in the work of funk. Funk scholar, really sort of Ricky Vincent, argues that funk is, quote, a deeply rooted in African, he argues that funk is, quote, deeply rooted in African cosmology. The idea that people are created in harmony with the rhythms of nature and the free expression, let me read that again. It's deeply rooted in African cosmology, the idea that people are created in harmony, that people are created in harmony with the rhythms of nature, and that free expression is tantamount to spiritual and mental health, end quote. This kind of African cosmology is heard in the records and performances of Parliament Funkadelic and, of course, Earth, Wind, and Fire. Further, really, musicologist Teresa Reed takes Ricky Vincent's remarks and moves them sort of diasporically to actually the U.S. Black church. And she argues that funk, quote, captures the soulful spontaneity of the sanctified church and the animated exhortation of the sanctified preacher. She continues to say that the music also emulates and incites she continues to say that the music also emulates and incites a kind of emotional intensity parallel to the Holy Spirit kinds of possession, which is the trademark of the sanctified worship service. And that's the full quote. These two clear-most examples of this would be Sly Stone and James Brown, both wanting to, of course, take us higher. These spiritual and secular planes of music and funk are not oppositional, but rather, as Angela Davis, yes, I'm talking about that Angela Davis, the activist Angela Davis, in her writings about music, and I highly recommend folks actually check them out. She's written about how the kind of Black musical kinds of traditions, and especially for her, really the blues, have also been spaces of the meetings between really the secular and the spiritual. This is in large part why we shouldn't read Prince's play with the spiritual and the secular as being on two kind of opposite sides, but rather like on albums like Love Sexy and Come, or on songs like Controversy in 1999, they very much really sort of work together. And they work together in exciting and really innovative ways. And it's at this point, for me, about Prince's innovation that I want to turn to really the last thing that I'll kind of talk about today, that mentions the overlap between Prince and North Minneapolis and funk. And that here I want to talk about technology. So really the world very much reveres Prince's efforts around technology. Indeed, as folks like really sort of Neil Dash and D'Angelo Duff have all talked about, Prince had a love and appreciation for really technology. And he took innovative approaches to tech. Here I'm thinking about the Oberheim synthesizer, the LM1 Lindrum, the Fairlight synthesizer, his forward-thinking ideas about the possibilities of the internet, his commitments to Black youth and coding. Prince is a tech geek. And again, I'm quoting really sort of Neil Dash here. But I wonder if we don't get to that kind of sort of geekness or geekdom of Prince, if it weren't for the TV shows that Prince watched actually growing up in North Minneapolis. As Prince's cousin Chaz Smith once explained to me, Prince loved shows like Get Smart and Batman and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. These were popular shows. These were very much popular shows during the 1960s. But they were also shows that centered on gadgets and technology. They centered new technology that warded off the bad guys to help us save, so they used technologies to ward off bad guys and help us save the world. Prince believed in the progressive possibilities of tech, the utopian ideal of new music kinds of technologies and of creative uses to other kinds of technology. So we can't champion that aspect of Prince with also considering the role that these TV shows actually played, right? I'm actually being serious here. I'm thinking about what role sort of TV pop culture played, especially these shows that use technology and gadgets that helped shape Prince's mind in terms of how he thought about the possibilities of really tech, right? These shows that he watched in North Minneapolis and their uses of technology and the kind of, again, the kind of liberatory kind of potential of these forms of technology. I want to think about how that might have actually influenced Prince. And of course, funk is all embedded in this conversation of tech. Funk has long been a site for actually sort of new kinds of technologies and new technological sounds. And I'm thinking here of the vocal kind of distortions of folks like Sly Stone and Parliament, and I'm thinking about Sly Stone and Parliament and Roger Troutman. Vocal distortions, of course, being central to Prince's alter ego, of course, of really folks like Camille. But I'm also thinking of the synthesizer and really Bernie Worrell. The creativity involved in how really Worrell, and I'm quoting Portia Martsby again, quote, use synthesizers to mimic the voice and bass and guitar and horns, which sort of generates an array of timbres such as growls and slides and screeches and unusual kinds of sound effects. And really Bernie Worrell's omnipresent synthesized strings added interesting colors and textures to chanted vocal lines and distorted bass lines, as well as the improvised call and response interplay between the rhythm and horn sections, end quote. So the synthesizer also became important in funk, as some funk bands like Dayton and Confunction de-emphasize horns and move towards synthesizers, right? This is a move, of course, that we see in something like Prince and other North and South Minneapolis bands who developed, of course, the Minneapolis sound. This is all to say that for Prince and for funk, and what I'm arguing here in terms of funk being Prince's guardian genre, is that their use of technology powerfully spoke back to the long and ugly racist and colonial history and discourse that saw Blackness and technology to be oppositional, that Black people were inherently incapable of being technological kind of innovators. Rather, they were just simply sort of technological kinds of consumers, right? What Prince is doing, what funk is doing, is really resisting, pushing back, combating, challenging that kind of racist and colonial and very much anti-Black narrative. And so it's at this point where I'm going to be circling back to really the political stakes of Prince's music, and it is going to be the kind of sort of end of my talk and how I want to end. And so I want to return to the song Northside. In some ways, Northside signals a lot of the overlaps of funk and North Minneapolis and Prince's life and career. We obviously get to the technological aspect of the song with the programmed drums and the kind of distorted vocals. We also get the dance and really the embodied movement aspect in terms of the song as well. As Prince instructs us to get down, 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 down. There are more downs, but I just wanted to sort of get to that point. But perhaps really most explicitly, we get the allusion to politics. Right? So in that clip that I had us all kind of listen to, Prince actually refers to Minneapolis as he refers to Minneapolis as Money Apple, right? Which I take in some ways as a potential dig at the capitalist and corporatization of various kind of metropolitan cities like Minneapolis, and the kind of negative effects of such a kind of really such a kind of transformation. In particular, I'm thinking about gentrification here. Indeed, Prince's discussion of land in the song's third verse, which you heard, has always struck me as a kind of provocative statement, as Money Apple and land raise the kind of specters, raise issues of private property and land ownership, which has, given the history of the city, this history of the state, history of this country, signals really sort of land dispossession of Native and Indigenous people. It also signals redlining and restrictive housing covenants and gentrification, all of which work really sort of collectively to really the dispossession of land and really the dispossession, it works collectively to the dispossession of land and the displacement of people of color, and especially Black and brown people. This has a close history of Black people in Minneapolis, right, who have historically been affected by racist housing policies. I'm thinking here also about sort of highway constructions and really eminent domain and their disastrous kinds of effects on neighborhoods like Rondo and North Minneapolis. But the political stakes of a song like Northside continue in the song's third verse as well, which again, I had you all listen to, or we listened to it sort of together. As Prince brings up Martin Luther King Jr., singing, quote, "Martin wasn't the only one that had a dream," end quote. This wasn't the first time that Prince would invoke really MLK here. Probably the more well-known or discussed song is actually another funk record. I'm thinking here about The Sacrifice of Victor. It's in that song's third verse that Prince brings up the series of uprisings that very much that really sort of very much emerged in the wake of King's own assassination, right? But Prince also uses that third verse to talk about school busings, of which he was a part of. He uses it to talk about racial segregation. He uses it to talk about the importance of education, and he uses that to also talk about Bernadette Anderson. And so when I think about The Sacrifice of Victor and I think about Northside, I think about how it's through very much a kind of illusion of really Martin Luther King Jr. that connects these two songs and the ways in which both songs, and really sort of remarkably, as Prince talks about them in terms of the third verse of both songs, he uses that as a point to think through the relationship between Black politics and Black culture. But while The Sacrifice of Victor has Prince looking back to the past, Northside has him thinking about the present and the future. Indeed, the present formations of racial capitalism within Minneapolis, or what he calls really Moneyapple, as well as the future possibilities for Black people in a city like Minneapolis. This is how I read the line that sort of he sings that Martin wasn't the only one that had a dream, or he actually raps it, where sort of he raps that Martin wasn't the only one that had a dream. Here, really, Prince presents us with the proposition, with the provocation of really imagining and centering really the dreams of those who are actually funking on the North Side. Sort of George Clinton once said that funk can save your life. And with a funk track like Northside, Prince gives us space to imagine these otherwise possibilities of Black life. Importantly, Prince centers those on the North Side. He centers those in North Minneapolis within these otherwise kinds of possibilities. And so what I read into this and what I see for us in 2020 and beyond is that it's high past time that we actually allow those who have experienced and resisted, and those who are experiencing and very much resisting racism's past and present violence, thinking about those on the North Side, to really direct us to new and brighter futures, to place us where their freedom dreams can be made true. So I will end there. I will thank you for listening and engaging me. I am looking forward to the Q&A. So Andrea Walker asks, Dr. Prowse, so how can I take class without being a matriculating student? Fantastic question. Well, I'll say this, feel free to email me. I can work in working on sort of lectures. Because of COVID-19, obviously I am teaching online. And so I've just been uploading my lectures. And so that's one way that in terms of next semester, because I'm teaching the class next semester again, that's one way that you can take it. I think there are other ways. If you are in the city of Minneapolis or in the state of Minnesota, I think there are certain kinds of policies where we can actually work with that as well. So feel free to send me an email. It's at ehpowell@umn.edu. I was like, I don't even remember my own. I was like, I somehow blanked on my own email, but that's, yeah. So like, if you email me, I can talk to you about that. But thank you so much, Andrea. Say Ron McLean, hey. So how does Black music of today inspire activism among our youth as compared to the impact and legacy of Prince? It's a great question. So there are two things that I'll say about that. One is part of what I do in my class is highlight, and hopefully I try to also make this clear in terms of today, is that Prince's music is still very much relevant, and that Prince's music still gives us spaces, imaginings, maps through which to be sort of more kind of politically aware and very much active. And so I still very much believe that Prince's music, right, is still very much relevant, still speaks to a lot of the things that are happening in terms of today. And so I very much believe that Prince is really key here. What I'll also say, and I've written one thing that's already come out this summer, and I have something that's coming out next year, I think at the top of next year, that's really about the music of her. So the Prince fam know that, her has, performed, so covers of Prince songs. But I'm really inspired by the work that her does and the kind of care and compassion and thoughtfulness that she has when she's thinking about her music and the political stakes of her music. So I would definitely recommend her. I would definitely recommend folks like No Name. I would definitely recommend folks like Rhapsody. This is also to say, right, that a lot of the folks, for me at least, who are doing the important work around activism in Black politics are Black women artists. And that should also that should not come as, I think, sort of some surprise, because it's been a thing in Black music for a very long time, right? So I quoted sort of Angela Davis, earlier in this talk. Her work when she talks about blues women, and the kind of sort of political importance of blues women singers like Bessie Smith and folks like Ma Rainey, and folks like Billie Holiday, right? And giving us the kind of sort of political tools in music to really sort of go out into the world and change the world. So there's that kind of continuation of folks like her and No Name and Rhapsody. It harkens back to it harkens back to the Black female singers of the blues of the early 1920s. But thank you for that, Zayron. So Adam Robinson, so will there be a bibliography or to read list available for us in terms of after the talk? Absolutely. I can send that to the Minnesota Historical Society, and I think they can just kind of post it on their website. And yes, so I can definitely do that for you. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Ruben Lance asked me, so I'm Dr. Proper, is there another musical artist of Prince's generation who has demonstrated such a love for his own city, neighborhood, community, and his or her music? So the answer is yes. But I am blanking out, just total blank on folks. Let me I did not expect that question. Let me come back to it. I'll say this though. That's something that I didn't talk about in terms of my talk today, that I think is really necessary, is that that funk that Prince is engaging in, obviously, right, is heavily influenced by folks like Sly Stone and James Brown. But I don't want folks to not think about, and that's in part why I actually mentioned Dayton, that funk did not exist in the Midwest, right? And this is also why I actually talked about the Ohio Players. I think that the funk that Prince is engaging in has a place within the Midwest, and the ways in which funk had sort of manifested within the Midwest, but folks from the Midwest had highly sort of influenced the kind of general kind of genre of funk. So I'm thinking, of course, about sort of Bootsy Collins as being a kind of prime example here. So I'll have to think more about your question. It's a fantastic question about other artists. I never think that folks are kind of by themselves in certain kinds of categories. I am just blanking out on people. So I'm sure that there are folks in the comments who are lighting me up and coming out with some really sort of basically sort of coming up with some really great examples. But I am, for whatever reason, my mind has just turned blank on that. But it's a fantastic question. Thank you. Other questions? Hey, Griffin Woodworth. What is the writer's name that Dr. Power is referencing who wrote about Prince and technology? I didn't catch that name. Yeah, so it was, so okay, so I was talking about really the work of, I was talking about the work of Anil Dash, and I was talking about the work of D'Angelo Duff, and how they have both written about and talked about Prince and sort of technology. I'm also thinking of folks like really, and I didn't talk about him. It was something that was cut from the talk. But Alexander Wahelier, who's at Northwestern, has also written about, he's also written about Black music and technology. He's also written about Prince. And so those are the folks who I'm thinking of when I think about Prince and technology. Pam Weiss, what brought you to Minneapolis? And for further ask, if I were deep into Prince before I got here, or was there the move that got me in terms of thinking about him deeper? Yeah, I mean, I've been a long time Prince fan. You know what, and to talk about sort of what brought me here was, so the University of Minnesota and really the Department of American Studies was hiring for a professor who did work in popular culture. And, I applied for the job. I had multiple rounds of interviews. One second. And I ended up getting the job. And one of the things that I wanted to do automatically when I got here, and I got here in 2014, was do a class on Prince. Like that was like the immediate thing. Like I got here in August of 2014. I remember talking to my chair. I was like, I think I want to do a class on Prince, focus on I wanted to focus on Minneapolis 1980s. I just wanted to kind of do it. And so I proposed it and it got approved. And like I said, I've been teaching it for the past 5 years. And so, yeah, I was just, and so that's been my thing. I've been really excited to be doing this class. It's always brought in some really fantastic students who have some really fantastic insight. And I'm just kind of thinking about other ways to kind of sort of get the class sort of growing and ways to change it. But yeah, essentially when I got here, I wanted to do the class on Prince because I had always obviously sort of loved Prince and just wanted a kind of outlet to further kind of talk about him with folks who might not know that much about him, right? And that was one of the interesting things when I first started teaching the course, and still now, is that a lot of students who take it don't really kind of know Prince, right? They always say that like they know Prince because their parents love Prince. And on the one hand, that makes me feel old. But on the other hand, students seem to also want to be taking it because they want to connect with their parents, and I just think that's really sweet and beautiful. And so I've just really enjoyed that on a very kind of personal, kind of level. So there's another question. Kevin Hassinger, I hope I'm pronouncing. Oh, hey, Kevin. Prince often demonstrated more straightforward rock influence in his guitar playing and distorted sound, obviously also influenced by blues and funk. Then for the question, sort of, did he ever mention his influences that were more purely rock and particular kinds of guitarists? Great question. So I'm gonna mess with your question a little bit, right? Which is to say that I think I'm gonna mess with it a little bit in terms of blurring kinds of genres. In part, right, is I think when we think about Prince's guitar work, there are a lot of great examples to folks like Santana, and those are accurate. As a number of people have mentioned about Prince, who knew Prince in terms of his teenage years, right? There was a lot of Santana playing. There was a lot of listening of Santana. And we know that Santana, both the artist and the band, mostly kind of sort of compared and talked about as rock. But one of the fascinating things to me, and one of the important things to me about folks like Santana, is that Santana is also a funk artist, right? I also think about Santana doing funk, right? And I think there's a way in which rock and funk, I mean, they're all coming out of rhythm and blues, right? They're all coming out of the blues. But there's a kind of sort of disarticulation between the two of them, when in fact part of the beautiful work that I think Prince was doing was really just highlighting the kind of genealogy, the kind of lineage that actually existed within Black music that further wanted to kind of showcase the relationship between rock and funk, right? And so that's how I'm going to kind of play with it, right? So like I in terms of your question, I automatically thought about Santana, but I also want to kind of mention that like I don't want folks to only see Santana as doing rock, right? I want folks to see Santana as also being a funk artist. So that's what I'll say there. But thank you for that question. Any other questions? Miranda Roman, where can we find your lectures? You can email me about those lectures. And we can talk about which kinds of lectures. So I also give more context about the class, right? It's about sort of music and sex culture in Minneapolis during the 1980s. It's about using the work of Prince as a window into understanding the relationship between music and sex and space in Minneapolis. And so some of the lectures are just about sex and space and gender and stuff like that. And then I have other kinds of lectures that are purely dedicated to Prince and to Prince albums, to Prince associated acts, right? So like Jill Jones and Vanity 6 and The Time. So those kinds of things. So again, email me. We can definitely talk about that. Thank you for that. Further questions? So in Mulga, would Prince have identified with Martin, Malcolm, or a little bit of both? It's a great question. So this is how I'm going to answer that kind of question. And it's also going to be useful for me. I'm gonna do a kind of shameless plug. I recently wrote a book called Sounds from the Other Side, which you can pick up at local bookstores, any kind of online kind of format. Sounds from the Other Side, the book is about sort of African-American kind of musical kinds of engagements, interest in South Asian music, South Asian culture. And the first chapter of the book is about John Coltrane. And this is how I'm actually going to start talking about Prince, is that one of the things that I actually make an argument in that book is that jazz scholars and jazz musicians have long compared John Coltrane to either being Martin or being more like Malcolm. And what I actually argue in the book is that John Coltrane might actually be more like James Baldwin. That the kind of spiritual kind of take that really sort of Coltrane had, I see is actually really resonating with actually the stuff in terms of spirituality in Prince. When I think about the contemplative music of John Coltrane, I think about Prince, right? I think about the Rainbow Children. I think about Love Sexy, right? I think about those kinds of moves. And so for me, I actually will say that I actually think that there are more kinds of resonances with Prince and Baldwin than actually Prince and Malcolm or Prince and Martin. Yeah. But thank you for that question. Further questions? Comments? Okay. It seems like we have run out of time. I want to thank you so much for being here, engaging me. Thank you for the questions. Feel free to send me emails. Feel free to sort of hit me up on Twitter. Please really sort of support the Minnesota Historical Society, other sort of museums, and yeah, Please be safe and please stay well. Thank you.